My first job was at the gas station down the street from my high school. I worked Thursday and Friday evenings. Every week. My shifts were 6 p.m. until midnight. Even though the schedule did interfere with my schoolwork, my parents allowed it because they thought it would be good for me to get some work experience. After my first few weeks on the job, I would be alone for the last 2 hours of my shift. There was another guy who would be there until 10 p.m. That was fine with me because it was usually really dead by that time. I was standing behind the counter staring at my phone. One night at around 11 p.m. Suddenly the door opened and a man walked in. He was tall, probably 6'2", with a long dirty coat and sunglasses. He wore a brimmed hat and also had a long beard, so I couldn't really see much of his face. My first thought was that he was going to rob the place, because it looked like he had made some effort to conceal his appearance. The guy slowly walked up and down the aisles. Then he stood in the back of the store next to the coffee machine. He just stood there. He didn't buy anything, and he never said a word to me or so much as looked in my direction. At 5 minutes to close, he simply walked out the front door the way he came. I didn't even have to ask him to leave. I was relieved when he left, but obviously creeped out. Why would anybody just stand in a store for an hour without buying anything? I guess it was not technically against any of our rules, but it was incredibly frightening for me, especially since I was alone. On my next shift, I asked my coworker if he had seen anything similar. Since he was more experienced than me, I figured he might have seen the guy before. My coworker told me that he had never seen anybody like that. That night, when I was alone again, the same creepy guy came in and did the same thing. He walked in the front door at around 10:30 p.m. and stood there silently. Several customers came in during that time, but I suppose it would not look as strange to them, since they were only in there for a minute or two. Just like last time, he left without any incident 5 minutes before close. Over my next few shifts, the same thing happened each and every time I came to expect it. From time to time, I would try to talk to the guy, but he would never respond. He wouldn't even look at me. I stood behind the counter one night. The creepy guy was standing on the other side of the store, as usual. I can't even describe how awkward it was being alone with this guy night after night. We had probably spent over 10 hours together alone collectively since I started the job. Just like usual, he left a few minutes before closing time. After he left, I walked over to the front door and locked it. Then I spent the next half hour or so on my closing routine. I emptied the garbage cans and did a quick sweep of the floors. Then I emptied the cash register and got it ready for deposit on my way home. When I stepped out of the store, I looked out to see my car alone in the dark parking lot. I was parked on the far side, past the pumps. I started walking towards my car, and suddenly I started to feel like I was being watched. Just then, someone ran out from the darkness and stood in front of me, blocking my car. It was that same guy from before, the one who just stood there in the store with me every night. As soon as I saw him, I ran back to the store, unlocked the door and scurried inside. When I was in there, I locked the door and called my dad for help. While I was waiting, I looked out the large glass window at the front and I could see that the guy was still standing in the exact spot where I last saw him. He hadn't moved. After about 10 minutes, my dad's car pulled up and his headlights fell upon the guy. The guy's face was completely lit for a split second, and when that happened, he took off running. To this day, I have no idea where he went. That was the last time I ever worked at that gas station, and from then on, I refused to take any night shifts at my other jobs. The people you run into are just way too scary. I have no idea who that guy was or what he wanted, but in my opinion, he was not all there, and I don't know what he was capable of. When I was 20 years old, I was working at a gas station on the other side of town from where I lived. I had recently finished high school, and I took the night shift as a way to make extra money, since my main job didn't pay very much. The gas station was open all night, but my shift was from 7 p.m. until midnight, which worked out well since my other job ended at 5. Sounds like a rough schedule, and it was, but if I'm being completely honest, the work was really easy. It was made even better by the fact that I really got along with all my coworkers. The actual store never got very busy, since most people would pay at the pump anyway. The night was usually a combination of scrolling through Instagram and cracking jokes with my coworker, occasionally being interrupted by a customer asking where the bathroom is. The late shifts always had 2 workers, not because it was busy, but for safety reasons. It's always best to have another person around to watch your back, and my coworkers and I took this responsibility very seriously. This incident took place on a Thursday night at around 11 p.m. It was me and one other guy, John. He was younger than me, 18, I think, and he was still in high school. He had short red hair and a smooth face. I don't think he even needed to shave yet. I'd been working there longer than him, and we had kind of a big brother-little brother dynamic between us. He would ask me how to do everything, even though I'm pretty sure he was smart enough to figure it out for himself. It was the middle of August, and even though it was late at night, the store was incredibly hot. Because of that, we would often prop open the door to the back alley. That way there would be some nice airflow whenever someone walked in the front door, always a welcome relief from the summer heat. All that being said, John and I had a great time talking and joking around. When the store was empty during the late hours, I was at the front of the store tidying up some of the shelves, and John was in the back organizing the stockroom when I noticed 2 cars pull up to the front of the store. One of them was an old sedan with some noticeable rust spots on the body. The other was a white minivan with tinted windows. The minivan went to one of the pumps and the car was parked in one of the spots at the front. I quickly finished what I was doing and made my way back to the counter in case one of them needed to pay for something. At this point, I was not sure if the 2 were together. I suspected that they probably were, because very few customers come in at this hour and 2 vehicles coming at the same time was unusual, to say the least. I waited for a few minutes, and eventually a single man walked into the store. He was a short guy, probably 30 years old and thin as a twig. He was wearing a white tank top and baggy blue jeans that seemed at least a few sizes too big. He looked straight at me with a blank look on his face. The man walked towards me, not breaking eye contact. As he approached the counter, I saw him reach behind his back, and before I knew it, I was staring down the barrel of a handgun. The store had a silent alarm that could be activated discreetly, but I was a few steps away from it and I couldn't risk making a move. John was in the back, and I knew he could hear whatever was going on in the store. So I said loudly, "No problem, sir. Don't shoot. Take whatever you want." That should have been enough for John to call the police. However, when I said that, the man rolled his eyes and smiled. Then he looked over to the side. I turned to look in the same direction, and what I saw was an unconscious John being carried out from the back by a second man. He must have come in through the open back door. That was when they asked for the money. I promptly opened the cash register and emptied it into a bag and handed it to one of them. Then I filled another bag with all the lottery tickets and handed that to him as well. The man holding John then said to me that if I didn't call the police, they would let him go safely. After that, both men walked out the front door, one of them still carrying John, and both cars took off. I stood there for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. I hesitated to call the police because of what the man said. However, I soon decided that I needed to call them, so I dialed 911 and reported the incident. The police arrived within minutes and reviewed the security footage. I waited as patiently as I could, considering the circumstances. Not long after, one of the officers told me that they were able to see the license plate from one of the cars. Not the smartest criminals, I guess. Later that night, I learned that both men were caught by the police, and I was brought into the station to identify them. A tremendous sense of relief washed over my entire body when I saw both those guys standing in a lineup. I quickly chose the 2 men who were not clever enough to cover their faces. After that, I asked one of the officers where John was. He looked at me with a solemn expression and placed his right hand on my shoulder. Then he told me that John had never been found. Search parties worked day and night for the next several days, but they turned up nothing and eventually they were called off. To this day, no one knows what happened to him because neither of the men ever talked and no evidence was found. It has weighed heavily on my conscience ever since. John and I were meant to watch out for each other, and I can't help but feel that I failed him. I always wonder if things would have turned out differently had I not called the police, as one of the men said. Maybe they would have let him go, maybe not. This story takes place one night when I stopped for gas on my way home from work. I worked at a restaurant, so I was usually there until late, sometimes after midnight. This time it was about 11:30 at night. I would pass this gas station every day on my way home from work, and I'm pretty sure it was open 24/7. The store part of the gas station was bigger than most. It was almost like a tiny grocery store because it had a decent selection of food, not just the junk food and snacks like some others. This place even had a tiny produce aisle. Because of that, I would often pick up some things there after filling up my car, since other places in the area were usually closed at the time. I was walking down the aisles of the store while my car was parked outside. I filled my basket with a few of the essentials that I always buy: bananas, eggs and bread. Then I walked around for a while, trying to decide if there was anything else that I wanted. I eventually made my way to the till and paid for my gas as well as the grocery items. Then I walked out the large glass door at the front of the store. I could see that my car was parked next to one of the pumps. The parking lot was dark, but the bright lights from the gas pumps were like a bright oasis. I started walking towards my car, and as I got closer, I could tell that there was somebody sitting in my back seat. I don't usually lock my doors when I go in because it's usually pretty quick, but this time I was in there for a while longer than normal. Also, my car is pretty old, so you have to lock them all manually. I know it's not smart, but those are my excuses, so take it for what you will. I inched closer to get a look at the person. It appeared to be an older woman hunched over. Her hair was covering most of her face, and the shade from the roof of my car formed a dark corner in the back seat where she was sitting, so it was hard to tell much about her. My first thought was that it was an elderly woman who wandered into my car. Confused, I stood a few feet away from the car while I thought about the situation. I considered simply giving her a ride to wherever she was going. I'm always willing to help people in need, but some part of me thought that was not a good idea. After a minute or two, I decided to call the police. I hate to get the police involved for something like this, and I made sure that they knew it was not an emergency or anything. Also, I did not want to press any charges. When the police arrived, I talked to the officers for a few minutes. After that, they told me to wait by the building to give them some distance. I couldn't see much from there, and the bodies of the two police officers were blocking what little view I might have had. I could tell that they opened the back door of my car, and before I knew it, they had pulled the person out of the back seat and put her in handcuffs. I thought that was unnecessary, so I ran over, shouting for them to stop. In my mind, it was just a confused old woman who wandered into my car by accident. But as I got closer, I could tell that it was not a woman at all. It was an older man, probably 50 or 60 years old, with long gray hair and several large tattoos on his face and hands. For some reason that I never figured out, he seemed to be wearing a hospital gown over his clothes. I stopped in my tracks when I realized that. Then one of the officers yelled at me to stay back. I backed up a few steps and continued to watch in disbelief. My heart sank when I noticed something. When the man was being frisked, I saw them remove a large hunting knife from under his clothes. He was definitely planning something for me, something that I wanted no part of. It's very scary to think that I almost got into the car with that guy sitting back there. Luckily, I made the right decision, and I survived to tell about it.